Cool. So we'll go ahead and get started. I'm just going to give a few brief introductions and talk a bit about the center and the series and what we're aiming for, and then we'll get right to the talk that you're all here for today. To introduce myself, my name is Louis Spanius. Normally, I serve as the Sustainability Program Manager here at Harvey Mudd College. Currently, for this semester, I'm serving as the Acting Director of the Hixon Center for Sustainable Environmental Design. And for those of you who are not acquainted well with the center, or perhaps are new to the things we do at the center, we're essentially the primary sustainability hub here on campus. And so that ranges from everything from the courses we offer to the research opportunities that we conduct and support and fund, to even campus sustainability efforts going on. So many of you might be aware of or have been involved with Power Down. That's one of the things that we're involved with. But we also hold a number of staple events throughout the year. And this spring speaker series, the Black, Gold, and Green series, is one of those staple events. And the series really started off as a way to sort of fill in the gap of existing speaker series on primarily and almost solely addressing environmental issues. And each spring we've sort of taken on a different tone and a different focus. And so if you were around last year, you might remember that a lot of our talks were a little broader focused. They were talking about these issues sort of holistically, looking at climate change policy, energy policy. We had speakers including State Senator Kevin De Leon. We had renewable energy expert Dan Kamen, people from the High Speed Rail Authority. So I was a little bit bigger. We were focusing on big projects and a little bit looking more sort of countrywide and globally. But this semester we really wanted to focus in on California, really touching in on sort of the recent events, not just over the last year, but over the last 5 to 10 years. Things including the drought, wildfires, looking at recent policy relating to energy and climate change, and sort of evaluate those things, try to understand more about what those things mean, why they're happening, and what that means going forward, and how the state can address those issues in a meaningful way, and perhaps how you as individuals can address those issues in a meaningful way. So for our first talk, we brought in fire ecologist, fire expert Johnny Keeley, who I'll briefly introduce, and I'll give him the chance to give his talk. And there will be time for questions afterward, and of course feel free to grab more food and drink as you go along. And this talk will be recorded and we'll make it available, so if you have friends or anyone who couldn't be here today, we'll have it on our YouTube channel for you all to view. So, Johnny Keeley is a senior ST research scientist with the U.S. Geological Survey. He's an adjunct professor at UCLA. He is the former program director at the National Science Foundation. He is a recipient of the Guggenheim Fellowship and is a fellow of the Ecological Society of America. He has spent sabbaticals in all 5 Mediterranean climate regions of the world. His research includes global change impacts on wildfires, ecological life history, strategies of plants from fire-prone ecosystems, fire-stimulated seed germination, invasive species, taxonomy of Arctostaphylos, and biochemical pathways of photosynthesis in vernal pool plants. He has over 400 publications, which have garnered more than 20,000 citations. He is a senior author as well of a 2012 Cambridge University Press book, Fire in Mediterranean Climate Ecosystems, Ecology, Evolution, and Management. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce John Keeley.
I think everybody can hear me. Okay, I don't need a microphone or anything. It's a pleasure to be here. I spent the first 20 years of my career as a professor of biology at Occidental College, so I kind of missed the liberal arts atmosphere. How many of you are from Southern California? Well, those of you who are from Southern California or have been here very long probably recognize the picture in the background. I like to think of that picture in the background as sort of a typical autumn day in Southern California. We get these massive wildfires that are juxtaposed with large metropolitan areas on a fairly predictable basis. And so much so that I love this article in The Onion where they talked about California's gather to celebrate their annual wildfire tradition. This is ingrained in our culture. Residents took part in rituals like picking through charred remains, feigning shock that this could happen to them. As it turns out, in Southern California, we have more homes burned per year than any other place in the world. We average, since the year 2000, 1,000 homes a year burned from wildfires. So this is a big part of living in this part of the world. Now, people like to talk about fire in California, and it's a really difficult topic to make sense of if you think of it statewide, because California latitudinally is the largest state in the western US, and it goes all the way from the Oregon border to the Mexican border, and it covers a lot of different ecosystems and a lot of different fire regimes. And that's one of the reasons why it's difficult to understand fire in California. We really need to break it down a little bit more than that. Now, simply, we could divide it between the northern part of the state and the southern part of the state. Ecologically, they're primarily different because much of the landscape in the north is dominated by forests. Much of it in the south is dominated by chaparral shrublands, which you can see when you look up the mountain from here. Also, population-wise, very different. About 10 times higher population density in Southern California than Northern California. And it translates into very different fire regimes in these two parts of the world. This is just the number of fires per million hectares. And this is for the northeast part of the state. This is for the southwest part of the state. About an order of magnitude more fires. Most of them in the northeast are started, or at least a good number of them are started by lightning, 45%, whereas in Southern California, 99% are started by people. So the origins of fire are very different, ecosystems are very different, and fire regimes are very different. This is a figure from a paper done by Forest Service employees, Hugh Safford, published a number of years ago. And what he did is he asked the question, relative to what we know the historical fire frequency was in the state, in these different ecosystems, how has fire in the last 100 years compared? And it's what fire scientists would call a fire return index or departure index from the historical conditions. The blues here, which dominate Sierra Nevada and northern part of the state, represent fire regimes that in the last 100 years, we believe there's been fewer fires than historically was the case. Whereas the yellows and oranges here in the southern part of the state represent a situation where we've had more fires in the last 100 years than historically was the case. And so right away we can see there's a lot of differences between the north and the south. North dominated by forests, fewer people, more fires started by natural lightning, and largely because many of the fires are started by lightning, they've been relatively easy to put out, and as a result, there's a deficit of fire in many of our forests because it's easy to put them out relative to the southern part of the state where we get fires started in chaparral shrublands, and they're not so easy. This was illustrated to me. I spent most of my career in Southern California where I was exposed to these chaparral fires that are extremely intense, and they move very rapidly, very destructive. I moved to Sequoia National Park, where I work now, and the first summer I was there, there was a lightning storm that came through the park, and I had an email message, and it said, the storm started 13 fires in the park. Tomorrow, let's meet to see what we should do about it. Now, you would not see that response in Southern California, because by tomorrow in Southern California, it would probably be all over with. But when you have fires in these forests, they're a very different phenomenon. Now, just to give you a very simple view of what fire is like in these different ecosystems, in the northern part of the state, much of the landscape dominated by trees. These trees tend to drop all their dead branches, and so they're relatively immune to fires carrying from the surface, where they tend to burn the surface, up to the canopies. And so as a result, forests historically have done very well surviving fires, which have been low severity or low intensity fires burning in the understory, because there's a gap in the fuels on the understory versus the canopy. And so those trees have survived for very long periods of time over multiple fires. Southern California, we don't see that at all. fires are what we call crown fires. They burn the entire crown of the vegetation all the way to the ground. And so we have a very different fire regime in this part of the world. Now, one of the interesting characteristics about these forest fires historically is they tended to burn very low intensity in the understory. They haven't killed the trees, but they have very often scarred them. This is a scar from these surface fires burn into the tree. And scientists have learned that if you cut a section through this tree like that, and you look at the rings, which are annual growth rings, you can also see scars, not just the most recent scar here, but you can see past scars, and you can actually come up with a measure of how frequent fires have been in the past. And this sort of study has been done repeatedly throughout the western US. There's easily 1,000 trees that have been we've recorded fire frequencies. Even giant sequoias. We have a record of fires in giant sequoia forests going back 2,000 years. So we have a good understanding of fire history in these forests. And this is an illustration of what most of these studies show. What we're looking at here is a timeline going back to the 1600s. Each one of the horizontal lines represents a tree. Each of the vertical hatch marks represents a fire scar. And what we see is historically there's been lots of fires in these forests. And they've been largely started by lightning, sometimes by Native Americans. But the thing that we see repeatedly throughout the West is those fire scars end about the late 1800s, early 1900s. And this is largely due to state and federal fire protection, whose job was to put out all of those fires. So we've changed the fire regime in these forests. Now, early on, that was considered a good thing because foresters were concerned about these low-intensity surface fires because they scarred the trees and they reduced the timber value. And so there was a push to make sure we got rid of all of those fires. But the downside is when you put out these fires, we have like 100 years of hiatus in burning, and as a result we've had an accumulation of fuels to the point where the conditions are much more hazardous and we're more likely to get crown fires. For example, this entire area here in this scene burned during a fire. The foreground here burned in what we think is probably typical of the historical pattern of burning. In other words, it burned in the understory, didn't kill most of the trees, maybe killed a few patches here and there, but by and large left the forest to survive. And those trees then would drop seeds into these burned areas and regenerate in these patches. The background shows an area what we should think of as very anomalous in terms of historical fire regimes. This is an area that undoubtedly had lots of fuels accumulate on the ground. As a result, those fires got carried into the canopy, and now we have a huge crown fire. That's a major problem because these forests are dependent upon parent seed trees to drop seeds into burned areas. And when you have a huge landscape like this burn, it takes a long time for those seeds to get from here over to here. And so it really cuts down on the natural regeneration of the forest. So this is considered an anomalous event, largely due to the success of fire suppression, which has essentially excluded fire for a century or more. Now we get to Southern California and we don't have that situation at all. We have these chaparral shrublands. When the fires burn, they burn through the entire canopy. They burn it all the way to the ground. Often it looks like what people describe as a moonscape. There's nothing left above ground. And if you look at the history of fires in this part of the world, it's very different. We don't have 100 years where there's been no burning due to fire suppression. Now, it's not because we don't have fire suppression. It's just that it's been very hard to put fires out in this landscape, and so suppression does not equal exclusion like it does in the forest. And we don't have this kind of fire scar record because we don't have trees, and if we did have trees, they'd get burned down in these crown fires. But we do have written records going back to 1910, and this is just an illustration for 3 Southern California counties of how much area burned every decade since 1910. This is on a log scale, so it basically shows that for LA County, about the same magnitude of areas burned every decade since 1910. And it translates into a rotation interval of about every 30 years, the equivalent area of LA County is burned to the ground. So it's clear in Southern California, we have not had a hiatus in burning. We've had as much burning as we ever had, and in fact, as that earlier figure showed, we probably had more fire than historically was the case. Now, what I focus on in terms of studying fires is how do we balance this concern over fire hazard? Because we're losing thousands of homes every year. We've got to be concerned about the impact on humans, but how do we balance that with resource protection? Because there's a lot of important resource issues tied up into this. Now, before I get into that, let me just introduce you to Chaparral for those of you who don't know much about Chaparral. It's dominated by a lot of different shrub species. The most common is this plant called chamise, has these little tiny needle-like leaves. It occurs almost everywhere chaparral occurs. The gray here shows chaparral distribution. The green shows chamise. It's basically wherever there's chaparral away from the interior mountains of the northeast and the northern part of the state, largely because chamise is sensitive to winter temperatures. And so it tends to not occur in that part of the state. But we have a lot of other shrubs, which some of you may know. Anybody know this plant? Have anybody hiked in the mountains around here and seen these plants with the red bark that has a little bark that scales off like this? And they're called what? You can just read it. Arctostaphylos. It's a genus of shrubs. It's the largest genus of woody plants in the state. Something like 70 species in the state, depending on your taxonomy. They're called manzanitas, and the reason they're called manzanitas is these flowers that come out in the winter end up developing into fruits, and those fruits look like little manzanas, which is Spanish for apple, and manzanita is a little apple. And so they look like little apples. Anybody ever tried to eat them? You can actually suck on them. They're actually kind of sweet. You can't really eat them because the inside is largely a hard stone. There's a story that I heard a ranger tell once that's almost certainly apocryphal, but he said Indians in this part of the world could go for 3 days eating nothing but manzanita berries. But he added they could go 4 days eating nothing at all. The other big genus of shrubs are ceanothus, and they have various common names. The blue ones tend to be called lilacs, because to the early pioneers they resembled the lilacs that grow in the east. They're not related to eastern lilacs. The California lilacs are in this genus Ceanothus. They also sometimes are called buckbrush, particularly the ones that have white colored flowers. There's about 60 to 70 species in the state. If you want to see the diversity of these two genera, just go across the street to Rancho Santa Ana Botanic Garden. I'm a research associate there, and they sell lots and lots of different species of Ceanothus and Arctostaphylos because they're used a lot in native plantings, in large part not just because they're colorful, but because they're drought resistant. Now, if you go out into an area burned in a chaparral fire in the first season, just months after the fire, assuming you get winter rains, so you may not expect to see this winter, it's going to look something like this. In other words, it greens up very, very quickly. There's lots of things that regenerate after the fire, and the regeneration comes about in a couple ways. One is, many of these shrubs, like chamise here, have this basal swelling called a basal burl or a lignotuber, and they have buds at the base there, and those buds initiate new shoots once the stem is burned. A lot of the chaparral shrubs produce these sprouts after fire, so a lot of that greening up comes just from the resprouting of the plants that were burned. And in fact, this resprouting can happen within days of the fire very often. Now, in addition to resprouting, a lot of our shrubs, particularly chamise here, Arctostaphylos, the manzanitas, and Ceanothus, they produce seeds once they're of age, usually 20 years of age or so. They produce seeds, and those seeds don't germinate. The seeds go into the soil, and they lay dormant, and they can lay dormant for a century or more until fire stimulates their germination. And so there's a number of species that will produce dormant seed banks, and those seeds are stimulated by fire. And this just illustrates the pattern of regeneration you see in these species. This is a bunch of Ceanothus species after fires here in Southern California. And this is the percentage of seedlings we see first, second, third, fourth, fifth year after fire. And what we see is uniformly they all are germinated right after a fire. In other words, there's a single pulse of reproduction, and then you see no more reproduction from then on. So it's something timed very, very closely to fires. There are certain species, though, that don't produce seedlings after fire. They don't produce dormant seed banks, but they're very vigorous resprouters. For example, a lot of oak species, scrub oaks, prunus species, rhamnus species. They don't produce seedlings after fire, but they're very vigorous resprouters, and so they will come up from resprouts very vigorously. Now, the most spectacular thing, aesthetically at least in Chaparral, are all the wildflowers that come up after fire. In the state, we have probably a couple hundred species that are largely restricted to post-fire conditions. And they come from seeds that have been laying in the soil dormant for as long as it takes from the last fire. A century or more, we know they'll survive. And then fire stimulates their germination, and you get this profusion of wildflowers after the fire. Now, when I was teaching at Occidental for a number of years, my students and I were very interested in what it was that triggered the germination of these seeds. And I was always taught as a student it was heat from the fire that stimulated the seeds to germinate. In other words, it would break the seed coat and they would germinate. But the work we've done showed, and we're not the only ones, a lot of people have been working on this, is that it's actually chemicals from the burned biomass of the fire that triggers germination. And this is just an illustration of 6 different species where we've tested germination along this axis under different conditions. These are control conditions. We just simply give them room temperatures with water. These are heat-treated seeds. These are seeds that we expose to ground up charred wood. And then these are seeds we've exposed to smoke. What we found is in the vast majority of species, it's some chemical from charred wood or smoke that triggers germination. And for some of them, this is a qualitative response where this species eminenthe, nothing will germinate under controlled conditions. Nothing germinates with heat. But you give it the right amount of smoke and you can go from 0 to 100%. So this is clearly a highly co-evolved system between fire and these species. And in fact, many of the species we know go back a long time in the fossil record, and we have good evidence that fire has been present in these systems for a very long time. And this is just an illustration of how far back in the fossil record we have an understanding of these species. This is an illustration of the Cenozoic, or what used to be called Tertiary period. And we have evidence of fossils from all of these genera, which are common in Chaparral, going all the way back almost to the Eocene, 50 million years. So these shrubs have been around for a very long period of time. It turns out, though, the ones that have been around longest are what we call obligate resprouters. In other words, they only come back by resprouting. And it suggests to us that fire was around at that time, but it just wasn't predictable enough for the plant to tie its reproduction to fire. And it wasn't to the Miocene, around 20 million years ago, we start seeing these 2 genera which produce seeds after fire. And so we believe that in the Miocene, about 20 million years ago, fire became very predictable in the western US, predictable enough to select for these chaparral shrubs. Now, just to summarize, I used to tell my students that chaparral is fire adapted. I now feel like I have to retract that. In fact, I feel like I need to recall all those students and retrain them, because it's really a misnomer to say chaparral is fire adapted. it's adapted to a very particular fire regime. And if you deviate from that regime, it can create problems. Now, the fire regime concept is just a way of describing the particular conditions of a fire in a system. And in many of our ecosystems, like Chaparral, we tend to think of fire not as a disturbance, which historically is what ecologists have thought of fire as, but it's an ecosystem process. It's something those plants have to have. And the disturbance in the system is when you deviate from that historical fire regime. And this is the regime for Chaparral. It's adapted to very high intensity fires. You really can't get a fire hot enough to kill Chaparral permanently. It's adapted to very massive landscape scale burns, and that's because it recovers endogenously. In other words, from seeds in the soil, from resprouting. So it doesn't matter how big the fire is, they still come back. But the one thing that they're sensitive to is the fire return interval, and we believe historically this system had a return interval of somewhere between 30 and 130 years. And if you deviate from that regime, you potentially could disturb the system and reduce the survivorship of chaparral shrubs. And this is an illustration from a series of fire in San Diego County. The Laguna fire in 1970 burned this entire landscape, which is just around the town of Alpine in San Diego. Then in 2001, this whole area here burned in the Viejas fire. And then in 2003, this portion burned a third time in the Cedar fire. And what we're seeing here is the chaparral is recovered naturally after that fire that occurred 30-some years ago. Here it is after a fire that started about 31 years later, the Viejas fire, and all of this is native revegetation, so it's doing just fine. Here, this part is an area that has only had a 2-year span between fires, and what we're seeing is a loss of the native species, and all that golden color you see are exotic grasses that are not native to our system. And that is the major threat in Chaparral. Here's another illustration. This is the Santa Monica Mountains, and the Santa Monica Mountains are dominated by chaparral shrublands. This is a similar site in the Santa Monica Mountains that's burned 3 times in 12 years. We've totally eliminated all of the seeding species, and we're left just with scattered patches of resprouting species. Most of what you're seeing here are exotic grasses and forbs. In other words, non-native species that are annual plants. It's changed the complexion of the system, and it's a concern for a number of reasons. As a conservation biologist, I'm concerned because we've lost a lot of our native diversity. These are all native shrubs. These are mostly all non-native exotic species. In terms of fire regime, we've changed the fire regime. This landscape here will probably only be susceptible to burning about 6 months of the year. This landscape here, those grasses dry out very fast. They're susceptible to fire 12 months out of the year. So we've changed the species composition, we've changed the fire regime. If you're a hydrologist, you're also concerned because these slopes here are very stable because the chaparral shrubs have deep roots, they hold the substrate. These grasses have fibrous roots and they don't hold the substrate. And this is where you tend to get debris flows after a fire because there's very little to hold the slopes. It's also of concern to people who are thinking about global change and carbon balances because there's much more carbon being stored in this landscape than this one. So there's a lot of reasons why we should be concerned about this happening, and we're seeing it happening more and more. This is San Diego County, and these are fire perimeter maps from fires in 2003 and 2007. The green indicate 2003 fires. This is the big Cedar fire, and here's another 2003 fire. The yellow represent 2007 fires. So a lot of the county got burned twice in a period of 4 years, way too frequently for those systems to survive. And we estimate something like 60,000 acres reburned before the vegetation was likely resilient enough to recover. And so it's a major concern, and particularly when we look at this map I showed earlier, much of Southern California has had way more fire than historically was the case. And so much of this region is susceptible to being converted from native shrublands to grasslands. This is a study we just recently published, which this is the Mexican border here, Santa Barbara up here. All that purple indicates areas that in the last 70 years have been type converted from native shrublands to grasslands. And so when you drive up the coast along Highway 101, you see landscapes like this. What you're seeing are remnants of the native shrublands. Most of it, though, has been decimated and replaced with these non-native grasses. So this is a major problem in California in terms of resource protection. Now, another major problem has to do with climate change. And more, when you pick up newspapers, you're seeing headlines like this, that scientists see climate change is causing major changes in our fire regime. And it's something that we've been looking at very closely in the last few years, because it's a really complex issue for the state of California. As I pointed out earlier, it's a very large state with a lot of different climates. And so the potential for climate change impacts is going to be very different from one part of the state to the next. This is one of the reasons people are convinced climate change is having an impact on fires. This is a paper published last year in the Proceedings of the National Academy. And what the authors did is they took all of the western U.S. here, and they calculated for given areas in the western U.S. The fuel aridity in a given year, and they estimate that through a lot of calculations based on fuel moisture and climate at the time. And the blue spots indicate the amount of area burned versus the fuel aridity in that year. And the red indicate the same thing, only in the last 15 years as opposed to the previous 15 years. And what the authors showed is we're getting the red spots, more of them up here. In other words, we're getting more big fires in the last 15 years, and they're associated with more arid conditions. And it's this sort of generalization that has made us think that climate change potentially is affecting fire regimes. Now, when we started our research, we realized there are a lot of other questions that ought to be looked at. For example, how do recent fires compare with long-term changes? We have fire records going back to 1910, and this is just an illustration of what U.S. Forest Service burning looks like over the last 100 years. We actually had lots of burning in the 1920s and 30s, and just like we have now. And so we've been interested in how does the long-term climate change, and how does that relate to patterns of burning. Other questions is, if we're concerned that climate change might be affecting fires, we need to understand that climates are changing differently depending on whether you're thinking about winter, spring, summer, or fall. And in fact, most of the climate change models indicate that most of the change is likely to happen in the winter. And so we've tried to sort out burning in all the different seasons with temperatures to see what control the season has. And then another important aspect to these studies that we felt was worth focusing on is these studies that look at broad regional areas are actually confusing both spatial variation from temporal variation. In other words, some years are drier than others and they burn more, but also some parts of this region are just historically drier and burn more. And so parsing out the role of spatial and temporal variation is important. And this just illustrates some of the reason we believe that's true. This is California, and the green spots indicate Forest Service lands that we've been focusing on. These graphs here look at the amount of area burned relative to winter temperature, spring temperature, summer and autumn temperature. When we take the entire state of California and we look at this relationship between the temperature in a given year and how much area burns, we find a significant relationship every single season. But some of that variation is due to spatial variation, And it's partly why these data tend to be clustered, because this tends to be the northern part of the state, this is the southern part of the state. When we break down the state into different climatic zones, we produce data something like this. This is the Sierra Nevada. This is the mean temperature in the winter, spring, summer, and autumn. What we find consistently is no matter where you are in the state, it doesn't matter what the winter temperatures were like. It doesn't affect fire activity. So that's something to keep in mind. If we're going to start predicting what global change is going to do, and most of that change might be happening in the winter, we need to understand that may not be having an impact on fires. We do find consistently in a lot of parts of the state, spring and summer temperatures seem to be very important. Now, this is the study that we just recently completed, where we looked at CAL FIRE lands, which are the lands in brown there. Those are the lower elevation state protected lands. The green here are Forest Service lands. They tend to be the montane zone and higher elevation. What we did is we went through, we have fire records for CAL FIRE lands going from 1919 all the way to 2016. Forest Service, we have records going back all the way to 1910. And what we did is we took those records, and then we have good historical climate data, and we've asked the question, relative to what the temperatures were like in a given year, how did that affect fire, or how was it correlated with fire activity? In other words, this is just an illustration of what winter, spring, summer, and fall temperatures look like from year to year in most places in the state. In other words, some winters it's cold, some winters it's warm. And what we did is we took that natural variation in year-to-year temperatures in spring, or winter, spring, summer, and fall, and we asked how did that relate to the area burned in that year. Now, I won't go through all of the data. What I'm going to do is just pick out two areas that represent extremes that we've seen in terms of the climate-fire relationship. One of those extremes is the Sierra Nevada Forest Service land. These are the high elevation forests. And what we find, if we just take mean temperature in these different seasons, we see that spring and summer temperatures have a significant relationship between the temperature and how much area burned that year. Now, it's not a huge significance. We're only seeing about a quarter of the variation from year to year explained by temperature, but as an ecologist, you're kind of grateful for even small relationships like that. As I said before, the one thing that is consistent is we never see in any part of the state a relationship with winter temperatures. So it's really important what's happening in spring and summer. Now, if we go to another part of the state, for example, Southern California, so here we're looking at the Sierra Nevada, which is this area right in here. Now we're looking at CAL FIRE lands in the southern part of the state. They tend to look like this, Chaparral. These are the patterns that we typically see in Southern California. In other words, we're not seeing any relationship between climate and fire activity. So it's very different from the Sierra Nevada forest, where we know climate does have an impact on fires. In Southern California, it doesn't appear that climate is a big determinant of how much area is going to burn each year. And we think the primary reason is because in Southern California, every year it's hot enough and dry enough to get a big fire event. So it doesn't matter that one year is a little hotter than another year. And that's illustrated here. If we look at the relationship between summer temperature and fire activity, which is that line there in the Sierra Nevada, we find that when the summer temperatures are up around 19 degrees centigrade, we have the most area burned. If we look at Southern California, the lowest summer temperatures we ever get are 19 degrees. And so we're always hot enough to have a big fire event. And so we believe that in the southern part of the state, climate change may not be the biggest thing that we need to be worried about, that there are other factors determining our fire regime. Now, obviously there's more going on than just temperature, and this is a multivariate analysis where we're looking at a lot of climate parameters. And we find that in the Sierra Nevada, we can explain, if we break it down just into the last 50 years of data, we can explain about half the variation from year to year just based on temperature in the spring and temperature in the summer. That's at least consistent with the idea that global warming is impacting fires in forested landscapes. What's interesting too, though, is we have a long historical record, and if we look at the first 50 years here, we find there is a significant relationship between climate and fire, but it's a totally different relationship. It's not based on temperature, it's based on precipitation. And that's an important lesson, because if we start looking at the relationship between climate and fire, we need to appreciate that can change over time. And it has in the Sierra Nevada. And in fact, when you look at the area burned in the Sierra Nevada relative to what we call temperature and rainfall anomalies, and that's this figure here is the spring temperature anomaly. And by anomaly, what we mean is for a given decade, how did the temperature in spring for that decade, how did it compare to the long-term average temperature? And anything above this line here, which is the 0 line, means it was hotter than the last 100 years. What we've seen in the Sierra Nevada, it's been hotter for the last 4 decades. And that's at least consistent with what we believe is going on with global warming. But it's interesting, when you look at the first couple decades, warming was not of particular importance at that point in time. And we believe the big anomaly in the 20s was the rainfall or drought events during that period of time. So the long story short is we can explain a lot about fires in the Sierra Nevada forests based on climate, and that climate model will change over time. And there's no reason to not believe that it might continue to change, so that if you look in the next 50 years, there may be other parameters that are maybe more important than spring and summer temperatures. Now, if we look at in Southern California, we basically, if we look at all the climate parameters over that period of time, we see no relationship at all between climate and fire. If we look at the first 40 years of records here, we see no relationship. Interestingly, though, in the last roughly 50 years, we have seen a slightly significant relationship, and it turns out that it's tied to the prior year precipitation, and it's a positive relationship. The more rain you get the year before in Southern California, the more likely you'll have fires the following year. And we believe that's due to this problem that we mentioned earlier of type conversion. In the last 70 years, we've seen lots of shrublands change to grasslands, and grassland fires are controlled by biomass. If you don't have a good rainy year to produce biomass, you won't get a fire. For example, we had a big drought a few years ago, and I had reporters calling me up and asking, what's the impact going to be on fires? Are you going to have more fires? And I had to point out to them, it depends on where you're at. In the forests, drought probably means more fire. If you're in the foothills, drought means you're not going to have fires because you don't have any grass growth. You have no fuel. So it's important to keep in mind that different ecosystems are going to respond differently to climates. And just to summarize this, this is how I like to look at ecosystems and their fire regimes in the state. And these are labels that I put on them. And they're not necessarily mutually exclusive, but they describe to me what I think is the primary factor to be concerned about. Forests are what I call flammability limited ecosystems. In other words, some years it's just too moist and too cool to get a fire to burn in the understory of the forest. And so they're limited by their flammability. So when you have a high temperatures in spring and summer, you're more likely to get fires. So they're limited by the flammability of the fuels. Now, if you get into the foothills are dominated by grasslands, and they're fuel limited. So if you get a drought, you're not likely to have fires there. They're limited by the fact they don't have any grass growth, they don't get as many fires. And then there's other places like Southern California. I like to think of them as ignition limited systems. They are dependent upon people starting fires under the worst possible conditions. And that's really what determines fires in this part of the world. And I'll elaborate a little bit more in a second on that point. Let me just summarize, though, what we have learned about fire and climate in the state. The best model we can come up with can explain 50% of the variation from year to year in forests. And for a lot of ecosystems like Southern California, it doesn't explain anything at all. What it tells us is about half or more of the variation from year to year in fire activity is due to something else. In other words, climate change is not the only game in town. One of those factors is long-term drought. Now, long-term droughts, we mean droughts that last like a year or 2 years long. Those aren't captured in our climate studies because we're looking at seasonal climates. And there's lots of reasons to be concerned about drought. This is a photograph taken on my back porch looking up at Case Mountain, which is BLM land just outside the park. And these are all dead ponderosa pines that were died during the drought in 2012-2014. And now, if you look at drought mortality maps in the state, you'll see the Sierra Nevada has massive tree drought. Now, a lot of people have pointed out that this is clearly a result of global warming. We don't necessarily know that because droughts are not as easily predicted by climate models. The other thing, though, that's going on is we have to realize that in these forests, for the last 100 years, we've been putting fires out. And this is an illustration here of one of these fire scar chronologies. These are the different years there were fires. The last fire in most of these forests occurred prior to 1900. Since then, there's been no more fires. What does that mean? It means the forest has gotten denser. There's more trees in that forest. And the more trees you have in a given part of land, the more competition for water, the more likely trees will die. We have not yet gotten to the point where we can parse out how much of this mortality is due to fire suppression, allowing tree density to increase, and how much of it is due to the severity of this particular drought event. And it's something we need to be concerned about. This is the Palmer Drought Index in California and the different climate regions. And 0 indicates the long-term median. And anything above 0 means it's a wet decade. Anything below 0 means it's a dry decade. And what we see is that in the South Coast, on average, in the last 4 or 5 decades, we've been in a drought. And so this is something that we need to take into account when we're thinking about these big fire events. Because what happens in these droughts? What happens is plants die. This is a scene that was shot after the 2003 drought in Southern California from just up the mountain, San Gabriel Canyon. All of this was dieback of shrubs that had died from the severity of that drought. There was a 50-month drought prior to 2003 and produced a lot of dead vegetation. We're seeing the same thing again now. This is a graph I just saw at a meeting for the Santa Monica Mountains. We had a severe drought in California from 2012 to 2015. In many parts of the state it ended, like in the Sierra Nevada it ended. In Ventura, Santa Barbara County, it didn't end at all. This is mortality of shrubs, chaparral shrubs, in 2014 after that drought. And you can see some species, like the Ceanothus species, 90% of the shrubs have died. So we've been seeing severe drought events, meaning more and more dead vegetation. Now, this is a compilation of all the, what I call megafires in the state. And those are all the fires that are over 100,000 acres in size that have ever happened historically in this part of the world. And we find there's 10 of them historically that were that size. The largest was in 1889. We've pieced that together based on newspaper reports. It occurred in Orange County, San Diego County. We estimate it was probably over 300,000 acres in size. Interesting thing about that fire, it's probably the biggest fire we know of in the state. Nobody died and no homes were burned. And that's because there was nobody living in Orange County or very few people. Actually, 1889 is when Orange County was incorporated as a county, but very few people were there, so very little damage. What's happened over time is we've had periodically more and more of these big fire events, and more of them are tending to result in the loss of lives as well as increased property losses. So what we can conclude from this is that over time, fires haven't really changed in this part of the state. We've always had big fire events. What's changed is people. We have more people in this landscape than we ever did historically, and more people now are put at risk, and so now we're having worse and worse effects on people from those fires. Now, having said that, I'll point out one thing that has changed in terms of fires. This is the 10 largest fires in the state, and you'll notice that 6 of those 10 largest have occurred since the year 2000. What we are seeing is more of these big fire events, and we believe that primarily the reason we're seeing more of these big fire events is simply because we have more people in the landscape and they're starting more and more of these fires during extreme conditions. And those conditions are the conditions that we see during the autumn months, September, October, December. And those months that are marked in red are the months where we get Santa Ana winds. And this is the number of days of Santa Ana wind events. And those are usually where we get the worst fires. And the reason we get bad fires is because people start fires during the autumn winds. Sometimes it's accidental, like burning debris or shooting off flares to signal somebody. But other times they're intentional, like arson, ignited fires. Sometimes they're power lines that get blown down by the winds. The more people we put on the landscape, the more chance we have of getting a fire during these extreme conditions. And the reason we describe Southern California as being ignition limited is even though it's the Santa Ana winds events themselves that cause the fires to be so bad, we get Santa Ana winds every single year. But we don't get fires every year. In fact, we did a regression analysis over the last 30 years of the number of Santa Ana wind events versus the acres burned. And the relationship is 0. There's no relationship between the number of Santa Ana wind events and the amount of area that burns. And that's because they occur every year, and it's only in certain years people start fires during those conditions. And so ultimately in our landscape, fires are controlled not so much by global warming, but by population growth, people starting fires under the worst conditions. And I could go on and on and on, I suppose, but let me just stop there and see if anybody has questions, because I'm happy to answer any questions anyone has. Yeah?
I had a question about the smoke germinating, what's the right word, germinating seeds. So do you know what the chemical was? You said it was a chemical in the smoke that you thought was triggering.
Well,
Do you know what it is?
we know that it's likely to be more than one thing, because we literally have hundreds of species around the world. In fact, if you go to other Mediterranean climates like South Africa and Australia, lots of smoke-stimulated species. This is almost certainly an adaptation that evolved independently in these different landscapes. And you would expect that any adaptation like that is likely to be triggered by different chemicals in different regions. We know in South Africa and Australia, many of the species are stimulated by an organic compound that's in the smoke. In California, we found that it's an inorganic compound, nitrogen dioxide, which triggers germination. And so we find that there's multiple chemical cues that can trigger germination. But the key to evolving an adaptation like that is it has to be a chemical that disappears once the fire disappears. Because if it was something common in the environment, then those seeds would just be germinating all the time. So to cue it to fire, it has to be something pretty unique to fire itself. Yeah?
So, given that we can't really stop the fact that there's so many people in Southern California, deal with these fires without disrupting habitat? What could you
Well, short of reducing population growth, which ultimately we will have to do, because there ultimately is a limit to how many people you can put into one place and still have them feel like they have some quality of life. There was actually a paper written a number of years ago about calculating what was the maximum number of people we could put on the face of the earth. And they based it on the heat exchange capacity of the world, that humans give off heat and the earth can only sustain so much heat and dissipate it at a certain time. They came up with a number of like 400 million billion people could be put on the face of the earth. But in a world like that, everybody would have a cubicle that's 3 by 3 meters, and so the quality of life wouldn't be very good. Although somebody pointed out that the number of Shakespeares would probably go up many-fold when you have that many people, but then he wouldn't have anything to write about. There is an upper limit based on the heat exchange of the world, but hopefully people will decide quality of life is perhaps more important. And so eventually we will have to come up with a way of controlling population growth. Now, since you will not find a politician anywhere in this country who will even mention the word population growth, we're not likely to see that happening anytime soon. So what can we do in terms of solving these problems while populations are continuing to grow? One of the things we can do is to do better land planning about where we put populations. For example, I have a colleague who is a fire management officer, said he grew up in the San Gabriel Valley here as a kid, and he said they never had problems with fires burning homes. And that's because at that time, the entire perimeter of the valley was surrounded by citrus orchards. Every time a chaparral fire started growing down the mountain, it burned into the orchard and burned out. But then they started cutting down the orchards and putting homes up. And now when those fires come down the mountain, they burn the homes. So better land planning is one possibility that could reduce the catastrophic effects of fires. Ultimately though, there's really a limit to it, to the planning, because you got to put people somewhere. Almost certainly the best thing that could be done in terms of reducing losses from fires is to build higher density landscapes within the perimeter of communities now. That's not desirable to a lot of people, but it keeps people from moving out into dangerous watersheds. The other thing we can do is a much better job at fire prevention. For example, we had major losses in Napa-Sonoma counties this October from Santa Ana wind type fires that burned and did more damage than any other fires in California. 40-some people died, 10,000 structures were burned down in Napa-Sonoma. And we believe that those fires were started by power lines that got blown down. And in fact, some of our biggest fires have been started by power lines. You can see that in the Witch Fire in San Diego, the Thomas Fire in Santa Barbara. A number of our fires have been started by power lines. There's a lot we could do in terms of reducing power line failures. One is to put power lines underground. Now, San Diego Gas and Electric doesn't want to do that, and even though they were hit with hundreds of millions of dollars in lawsuits. What they've done is they've put up weather stations around San Diego County, and they monitor the weather 24/7. And their plan is when the winds get very high in a particular region, they'll shut the power grid off there. So people are going to be without power. That's their solution. I think underground power would make more sense. But so far, it's been hard to sell it to them because they claim it's too expensive. But the Napa-Sonoma fires very likely were started by power lines. In that case, PG&E is potentially liable for like $6 billion in lawsuits. That may be enough to change their mind about underground power.
Wasn't there a case when like an eagle or a hawk or something flew into a power line and it started a giant fire?
Oh,
in
yeah.
Southern
Yeah,
California?
that's definitely happened.
Okay.
There's been a number of instances. In fact, in our neighborhood, we had something like that happen where a bird flew into a power line, and they basically I basically connected two different lines together, and the lines arced right through the bird, and the bird fell dead and started a fire. That's happened before. In fact, there's a really interesting story that was just published recently in South Africa, where they have observed that there are hawks. See, if you go into a burned area after a fire, what you find is it's just loaded with hawks. The hawks just come in after a fire because the animals that survive the fire have no place to hide, and so it's easy hunting for the hawks. And there was a story just recently published in South Africa where they found that some hawks would go in and pick up burning sticks and fly them to other areas and drop them and start fires. It would appear as though there may have been selection for this behavior as a way of increasing the amount of burned area. Of course, that's a lot of anthropomorphizing, but it may be. Anything else? Okay, thank you.